I want to welcome everybody to the panel on U.S. immigration and labor policy during the long age of restriction, unimagined complications and responses at borders and in fields. It's a long title. But I do want to begin by making sure everyone knows that we have enabled closed captioning. And to access this function, please select Live Transcript Closed Caption button at the bottom of your screen. Click the arrow on the top left of the Live Transcript button to hide or show the transcript. And this session is also being recorded and will be available on the AHA website soon, apparently. We'll see how this all works. I mean, I think it's foreign to everybody. Although maybe some of you have done some Zoom conferences over the last year. I did participate in a panel at the WHA back in October. So I'm just going to jump right into introducing. I will introduce each panelist before they present their paper. That way we don't have to sort of remember everything all at once. And then afterwards I will have some comments and then open things up to a discussion. I simply ask the panelists to make sure that they keep their presentations at a reasonable length, so we do have time for that discussion after. And there are 4 papers, so there's quite a bit to get through today. 4 excellent papers, I should say. So our first presenter this evening, I'm going to just go in the order that they're listed in the conference. What do you call it? What do you call it? The conference. My brain. Program. Damn, my brain. Okay. Our first presenter this evening is Patrick Lozar. He is currently assistant professor of history at University of Victoria in British Columbia, and he's a member of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes in Montana. Patrick's research on Columbia Plateau, indigenous communities, and the Canada-U.S. border has been published in the Journal of Ethnohistory and the Montana Magazine of Western History. And he's currently working on a book based on this larger research project. Today he is presenting a paper titled "The Indians Knew Little of International Boundaries and Cared Less: Interior Salish People, Status, and Labor in the Northwest Borderlands." So go ahead, Patrick.
Thank you so much, Erik. Okay, I'm going to try sharing my screen here and see if it works. Okay. Okay. Can you hear me okay? All right. So the immigration inspector collected Lucy Antoine's personal details on her entry card manifest dated 1846, shown here. The inspector noted Lucy's height, hair color, skin color, nationality, family relations, destination, and reason for entering the United States from Canada. The manifest stated that Lucy, of the Antoine family of the interior Salish Okanagan or Saelks Nation, was leaving her home at Enderby, British Columbia, to work in the orchards in Washington State and would be for a month. This card, the U.S. immigration inspector, the port of entry at Oroville, Washington, and the Canada-United States border were technologies of surveillance, control, and protection. At the same time, Lucy was participating in a generations-old pattern of migrating south within her indigenous nations' homelands to gather foods, and in this case, wages and cash, alongside other indigenous interior Salish people in a mentally and culturally unbroken landscape. These competing worldviews, one quite narrow and invasive, and one reflecting an enduring tie to land and people, extended the existence of a borderlands dynamic in the interior Pacific Northwest. Along with their interior Salish neighbors, people of the Okanagan Nation maintained social and cultural bonds of community across the 49th parallel in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As Okanagan people, they married within bands, relocated to various sites within their homelands, and engaged in cultural celebrations and ceremonies that defined their identity and they consciously interacted with the landscape of their tribal territories. As Dobkins et al. Observed of other Northwest peoples, quote, "For thousands of years, indigenous communities have organized their lives around subsistence systems that relied on their knowledge of the land and their free movement upon the land throughout the year to hunt, gather, fish, and cultivate the resources of the earth and waters." Such deeply ingrained patterns did not disappear in the reservation, reserve, and wage labor era or into the 20th century. They persisted and evolved. In the 19th century, the Canadian and United States governments began encroaching on Salish territory according to nation-state claims in the region that were set at the 49th parallel. The border between British North America, or Canada, and the United States in the far west ran through the homelands of the Okanagan people. Only in incremental ways did the border and the American and Canadian jurisdiction in the area become meaningful to Salish peoples in the decades after the border was defined in 1846. By the 1870s, the US government established the Colville Indian Reservation for the Okanagan and other bands in north central Washington, and the Canadian government set out reserves for Okanagan bands in British Columbia. The two governments then politically and administratively tied these bands to these geographical entities and claimed them as either American Indians or Canadian Indians. I'm going to use the scare quotes a lot, so just get prepared for that. In terms of the administration of their wards of the state via the Department of Indian Affairs or the Office of Indian Affairs through Indian agents, these entities worked to reorient bands and individuals towards Canada or the United States. Reorientation would make controlling indigenous movements easier and would deter travel across the invisible border that brought challenging jurisdictional issues. In this way, the reserves and reservations acted as a means of political relearning and a technology of supervision and surveillance. As reconfigured political entities, reserve bands and confederated tribes did direct their political activity towards the Canadian or US federal governments. This process of reorienting bifurcated indigenous people along the border would remain incomplete, and the region continued to exist as a borderlands. Due to the migratory nature of interior Salish harvesting patterns and their adoption of migratory wage labor opportunities, the people's activities and relations reinforced Okanagan nationhood. The designers of the reserve and reservation systems in the colonial governments intended these spaces to serve as sites of transition for Indians of from migratory hunters and gatherers to sedentary farmers. As settlement increased around these reserve spaces and as agricultural and frontier industries developed along with it, the need for workers grew apace. Indigenous families and individuals then participated in these industries as wage workers, some of the time. Okanagan people continued to move about, to hunt, fish, and gather according to the Columbia Plateau's seasonal round, while also taking on wage work when and where it suited them. Indeed, the wages from such temporary employment subsidized the interior Salish modified traditional or medicinal economy, particularly when there was a down fishing year or when attempts at farming on the reservation nearly failed. Reserve and reservation Indian agents in charge of their wards' transition to sedentary life often conceded or permitted their Indians engaging in wage labor, despite the seasonal and long distance travel associated with the work off the reservation. What they and their superiors did not account for was how wage labor fit in with Salish migration patterns within their indigenous homelands that, as Richard White puts it, they knew through work. The continued migrations and relations also reinforced Okanagan nationhood. As Chantal Norgard argues in the Great Lakes context, it was the indigenized wage labor in which Ojibways engaged became sites for the construction, expression, and practice of indigenous nationhood, unquote, on their lands. In permitting their wards to work in seasonal wage labor jobs, Indian agents acknowledged that interior Salish people could and would travel across the 49th parallel to work. As British, Canadian, and American citizens, Indian agents and local settlers in Washington State and BC put great stock in the meaning of the boundary lines that defined their nation's territory. The government's Indian wards did not recognize the land border with such instinctive reverence or even understanding. Aside from a few customs houses, there was little infrastructure at the line itself preventing Salish people from crossing the border, aside from reserves and reservations to which indigenous people were assigned, but they too were porous. Thus, when settlers started agricultural operations, particularly in the Okanagan River watershed, in British Columbia and then in Washington, Salish families participated in the harvest in the summer and fall seasons. As early as the 1890s, Okanagan people and their neighbors began migrating north for agricultural wage work. Local settlers and government officials admitted that allowing Salish families to leave their country's jurisdiction to help with the harvest was an economic necessity in the region. Making cross-border migrations palatable to agents was the fact that these movements were orderly and economically necessary and bore no resemblance to the turmoil or border escapes of, say, Chief Joseph's Nez Perce and others just a few decades before. There was also the assumption that because the work was temporary, the indigenous workers would return when the harvesting season was over, back to the Indian agent's jurisdiction. The budding hop industry of the Okanagan Lake region of British Columbia brought the first consistent waves of indigenous workers from the Colville Indian Reservation in Washington state. Lord Aberdeen, the Governor General of Canada, owned a ranch just north of the lake where his estate began growing hops for regional distribution. Aberdeen's Coldstream ranch managers use indigenous labor for the hop harvest, as there was an otherwise small pool of workers in the interior of British Columbia. The Aberdeens, however, believed that the Okanagan people in their vicinity prioritized socializing over work, a common racist trope. And so they coordinated with labor suppliers to, quote, secure sufficient pickers by bringing in imported Indians from across the border in Washington state, unquote, specifically from the Colville Reservation. Labor coordinators recruited Okanagan as well as Nez Perce bands from Colville to pick hops at Coldstream for the 5-week season. Coordinators escorted them to and from the border to make their crossings as seamless as possible, with as many as 100 people migrating north at a time. As the season concluded, these indigenous migrant workers socialized at fairs near the lake, raced horses, gambled, and purchased goods with their cash payments. In the fall, with their goods and extra cash, most of their hop pickers returned across the border to the Colville Reservation in Washington. In a later report by a Canadian government official trying to determine just who was Canadian Okanagan and American Okanagan near Okanagan Lake, observed of the hop picking social relations during this period that, quote, there came, therefore, from across the line, large numbers of Indian families who traveled up the valley to the Coldstream Ranch with pack horses and all their worldly goods to engage in the hop picking. These Indians, who were in the charge of the US government, came up in a succession of years. They had many relatives on reserves on the Canadian side, and some of them stayed on these Canadian reserves, purchased land, and were admitted as members of the band. A number of these Okanagan migrant workers stayed with relatives in Canada. These northern migrations from Colville continued into the early 1910s, but seem to have ceased around 1917, when the agricultural industry based on hops shifted more towards fruit orchards. In the Okanagan Valley, the burgeoning fruit orchard industry boomed from the 1910s to the 1950s and beyond, and Okanagan families and individuals traveled to take part in the seasonal picking work. The Okanagan Valley's mild microclimate and the large Okanagan River and its tributaries supported the growth of primarily apple orchards on down to the confluence with the Columbia River in Washington state. The orchard operations required labor for picking during the harvest, and Okanagan people took advantage of the work for cash. In an opposite flow of labor from the hop fields in the northern Okanagan Valley in British Columbia, Okanagan families from Canada went down to the United States for work. Over several decades, Okanagan people incorporated the apple picking harvest into their seasonal round of gathering local foods and fishing. Travel for seasonal wage work allowed Okanagan men, women, and children from British Columbia to work alongside and visit family and friends south of the border, which reinforced their relations in the process. Okanagan people traveling south along what became Highway 97 stopped at the Oroville port of entry, where immigration inspectors took down information from those entering the United States. Inspectors produced entry records cataloging a number of details, like, as you can see here on this slide. The details included how many times the traveler had previously entered the United States, who their intended employers were in Washington state, and whether they planned to return to Canada or to stay permanently. The records show that a significant number of women went to Washington for work. As noted in the manifesto for 1943 entry, Martha Mary Louis from Vernon, British Columbia, crossed with her sister on her way to work as a domestic in the town of Oroville, Washington. Other women, including Lucy Antoine from the top, and their families worked in Washington as laborers in the fruit orchard industry from Oroville down to Omak, Washington. Lucy Antoine's mother, Mary Louise, was originally from the Colville Reservation, and at an earlier visit with friends and relatives in BC, she married an Okanagan man named Jimmy Antoine. And the connections and migrations of the Antoine family were common and really representative. At the border, the immigration manifests mark that most arrivals were younger men from British Columbia reserves who crossed into the United States to work in the orchards for several months at a time. The immigration inspector made sure to record which agricultural company he was going to employ the immigrant laborer and for how long. Many of the entries listed the individual's duration in the US as indefinite, suggesting that they intended to stick around beyond the harvest season. A man named Raymond Williams later recalled from British Columbia, "When we were small, Mom took us with her down to the States to thin and pick apples. And then as an adult, during my time off, we went down to the States to thin apples," unquote. Elaborating more on this Okanagan Valley pattern, Lloyd Wilson explained, quote, "When I was old enough, I went with my mom and dad to Oroville to pick apples. Whole families went. They worked 7 days a week. They logged here in the spring and went down to the States in the fall. Dad was a night watchman and Mom and us boys picked apples. All our wages were pooled together and that's how we made it through the following winter." Sometimes the people would stay well after the picking season. Sometimes they would stay with relatives, and sometimes they married American Indians they knew or met during the season. Okanagan people crossed the international border to work in the orchard industry, neither of which was of their creation. Their participation in crossings, however, were carried out within their homelands and according to economic, social, and migration patterns that predated these institutions. Interior Salish people simultaneously traversed their indigenous territories and the Canada-United States border, and in the process, undermined the line's meaning as a marker of nation-state space. Into the 20th century, Okanagan's social and economic migration patterns adapted to changing regional industries based on wage labor. The border, reserves, and reservations and wages meant different things to these indigenous workers and migrants compared to Indian agents, border guards, and social reformers. Indian agents tolerated cross-border mobility and work as a means to an end. Okanagan people in particular experienced mobility for wage work purposes as a means of reinforcing trans-border community and extending their being on the land beyond the line. Interior Salish nationhood and mental maps persisted through these continued connections in the face of changing economies, international partition, and nation-bound Indian policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. So we're going to move to our second presenter. I want to applaud. I could do the little hand signal. I don't even know if I know how to do that. But anyway, there it is. Okay. So our second presenter this evening is Erik Bernardino. Erik has a master's degree from UCLA, but is currently a PhD candidate in the history department at UC Santa Cruz, where he studies the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, labor, Chicana and Chicano history, and immigration history. His dissertation focuses on the intersection of immigration policy and labor migrations in the Californias, Alta California and Baja California, at the turn of the 20th century, and how federal-level immigration policies relied on local-level morals, policing, to enforce national-level policies of border control. And he tells me that in his free time, he enjoys spending time with his family and watching baseball. He may, you can ask him questions about that instead of cross-border migration, perhaps. His presentation is called Making and Unmaking the Border. I'm sorry, Making and Unmaking Labor, Border Residents, and U.S. Immigration Policy. So, to you, Erik.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. And yes, feel free to ask me about the Dodgers. And I actually think your title, Flub, is a more appropriate title once I wrote the paper. So let me get started. Immigration Chief Inspector of the U.S. Department of Labor, Irving F. Wixson, arrived in Calexico, California in January 1926 and quickly formed an outsider's opinion of the Imperial Valley. Wixson thought local commercial stakeholders wanted the two border towns of Calexico and Mexicali, Mexico to, quote, be made one big community, end quote, even in the face of a burgeoning vice district south of the borderline. Wixson believed that the commercial stakeholders of Calexico thought the job of U.S. immigration officials was to promote cross-border trade and, quote, act as guides to the most approved mercantile establishments, end quote. Wixson, within weeks of his arrival, recognized what had developed in the region. The border did not exist in an Imperial and Mexicali valleys as it did in other places. Wixson believed residents had, quote, lost sight entirely of the existence of an international boundary between Calexico and Mexicali. End quote, sorry. There was, however, another vision of the border. Calexico immigration officials, led by Inspector in Charge Fred D. Jack, had recently started enforcing immigration laws that the newly created Border Patrol Agency seemed to empower. Jack conducted deportation raids at nearby ranches, deported Mexican laborers who had illegally entered the United States, and questioned people as they crossed from Mexico into the U.S. Jack's actions angered local business owners who started a campaign to try and remove him from his post. The attacks against Jack pushed U.S. Commissioner General of Immigration, Harry Hull, to send Chief Inspector Wixson to the region to investigate. Local Valley business owners accused Jack of acting as a, quote, border czar, handing down harsh edicts that violated the local norms of border enforcement. Commercial stakeholders accused Inspector Jack, who, according to Wixson, had no prior experience in immigration enforcement, of, quote, antagonizing residents of Mexicali, so much so that good relations socially and commercially cannot be restored, end quote, and wanted him removed. But what angered Calexico business owners more than anything were Jack's deportation raids at local agricultural ranches. The raids deprived the agricultural industry of the much-needed Mexican labor force by removing Mexican workers already in the valley. The deportation campaigns also kept other migrant Mexican laborers from coming into the Imperial Valley because they feared immigration officials would apprehend and deport them. Jack's raids, deportations of Mexican laborers, and his stringent regulations materially affected businesses, or so they argued. Local entrepreneurs wanted Jack removed, claiming that his actions depleted the only source of labor in the region. Wixson believed that Jack's restriction of laborers and border enforcement were the real problems, and that there needed to be some, quote, happy solution for all parties involved. Wixson, as an outsider who came into the valley, was not privy to all the different aspects of the region's migrant stream. After a month in the valley, observing and trying to understand its complexities, Wixson devised a plan. However, he built a solution to the worker problem on several critical assumptions about the border and labor migrations. Wixson criticized local business owners' attempt to control immigration agents, but also create a fluid border for commercial purposes. He assumed rightly that local business interests in the region had superseded federal border enforcement policy to restrict entries and close the border. Although Wixson recognized the need for Mexican agricultural workers in the Imperial Valley, he underappreciated the role that Mexicali's own local government played in supplying Calexico with Mexican workers. Chief Inspector Wixson, Imperial Valley business owners, and the local immigration officials chartered what they called a gentleman's agreement, which later was commonly referred to as the Passbook Plan. The plan placed Mexican men, women, and children who worked in the ranches and fields of Brawley, Calexico, and El Centro, all towns in Imperial Valley, on the path to legalizing their status and exempted them from deportations. Under the Passbook Plan, laborers over the age of 16 were required to provide proof of literacy and Mexican birthplace and would supply 6 photographs to the American consulate. Once laborers met these preliminary registration steps, the plan required them to make an initial monetary deposit toward their passbook fees, which covered a $10 cost for an American visa, an $8 charge for the immigration head tax fee. For these efforts, the Associated Labor Bureau, a grower organization in charge of overseeing the plan, issued Mexicans a passbook marking their participation in the plan. To remain current in the program, passbook laborers made regular installments toward these head tax fees. Once workers satisfied all head tax payments, the American consulate in Mexicali, Frank Bohr, certified the completed payments and issued visas legalizing participants' immigration and labor status in the US. The passbook plan was a continuation of the region's system of transnational labor migration. Although cross-border labor migration was not a recent phenomenon to the California borderlands. Paul S. Taylor, an economist who extensively researched migrant labor farm workers and conducted one of the earliest studies of Mexicans in the Imperial Valley, argued valley growers experimented with different strategies to address their labor needs. Taylor found that 1917 marked the shift to a more serious attempt to import Mexican labor by recruiting workers from the interior of California and the, quote, continued drift across Baja California. By 1926, when the Associated Labor Bureau endeavored to study labor supply for Imperial Valley growers, they built on past examples of organizing labor and looked to Mexican officials and entrepreneurs for help. For example, in 1919, Mexicali's Cámara de Comercio, its Chamber of Commerce, began a project of contract labor importation that fed the needs of American agricultural employers, not Mexicali's, Baja California's, or Mexico's. The chamber brought in workers from places like Baja California Sur under contract into Mexicali. Headed by Arnulfo Liera, a local proprietor, the system identified, organized, and transported laborers from the southern region of Baja California to work in the fields of northern Baja California. The year prior, in 1918, the Mexicali Town Council formed the chamber with the purpose of studying Mexicali's economic state of being and to try to develop plans to help ease the town's lack of industries, a problem since the town's inception and one that Vice Industries had tried to solve in the 1910s. Members of the chamber identified the lack of agricultural workers in the region as one of the most pressing and difficult problems they needed to address. One proposed solution was to write to the Mexican consuls of Nogales, Tucson, and Phoenix, Arizona, to and ask them to send information about laborers in their regions and how workable or feasible it would be to send those workers to Mexicali. Fernando Villaseñor presented another solution. He proposed renting a boat and bringing in workers from Baja California Sur, where the chamber, quote, knew workers were unemployed, end quote. The chamber built on Villaseñor's plan and placed Liera in charge of importing upwards of 2,000 workers. Liera charged a transportation fee of 25 pesos per worker over the age of 15, but the chamber would initially cover these costs. The chamber planned to recoup its costs by levying an export tax on local Mexicali agriculturalists, but in the interim, the banks of Calexico helped finance the project. By December 1919, Liera had imported 2,879 men, women, and children. The chamber was supposed to distribute those workers to the Mexicali agricultural fields that needed them. The goal of the project was to solve Mexicali's labor shortage, and the chamber contended it achieved that. However, transportation costs and the financing undertaken to pay for the over 2,000 workers revealed the project was not exactly a complete success. The chamber's plan called for collecting 10 pesos per person over the age of 15 and 5 pesos for children between the ages of 12 and 15 from the imported laborers. But collecting worker contributions proved difficult. Many workers left to work on the railroad or other points of their choosing. In all, the chamber collected less than half of the expected worker reimbursements. Even as the chamber claimed that many workers remained in the Mexicali region, the failed collection of their transportation costs suggested many workers did not stay. The reality was that Mexicali's laborers abandoned their contract and crossed into the United States to work in the Imperial Valley. In 1927, for example, one Mexican labor contracting company imported 13,000 Mexicans into Baja California, but 2/3 of those workers drifted across the line into the United States. As early as 1920, the Mexicali Chamber of Commerce realized workers' intentions and instituted worker movement and choice into organizing their transnational labor system that Calexico growers welcomed. Workers did not casually or by mere happenstance cross into the United States. Instead, Mexicali's contract labor system was a systematic approach to funnel workers to valley growers, instead of workers dispersing across California individually. Once Arnulfo Liera transported laborers into northern Baja California, American labor contract recruiters, who often worked in the dual role as both labor recruiter and contractors, met the workers in Mexicali and would entice them to cross the border to work in the Imperial Valley. Recruiters discussed wages, length of contract, and other working conditions to try and lure workers north. Later investigations of the 1926 Passbook Plan uncovered the contract labor system and its abuses. The investigators found that some contractors and sub-bosses would disappear with worker wages. Paul Taylor found instances where contractors did not pay or often withheld wages and bonuses, and suggested that growers use the bonus system to reward workers who remain for the duration of their contracts. By paying workers bonuses, contractors and growers also avoided charges of violating California labor law. Contractors would often also spend the money employers paid them and have nothing left for the worker. Or if a crop failed, many would have no financial resources to pay workers, since so many of the contractors were also land leasers and employers. By 1926, a member of the Brawley Chamber of Commerce who supported Wixon's Passbook Plan argued it, or some form of a centralized labor agency, would help solve the contract labor system, which he thought was the real problem. However, by 1926, Mexicali's local government had created its own centralized labor agency and had been funneling Mexican workers to the Imperial Valley for several years. In 1924, Mexicali opened a temporary labor bureau. The experiment, though, was such a success that 2 months later, in August, the bureau became permanent. The Mexicali Employment Bureau required employers to pay a nominal fee for using its services to hire workers for their fields. The stated purpose of this labor agency, much like Liera's worker importation plan, was to solve Mexicali's lack of workers. But the Bureau planned to provide laborers for the Imperial Valley, especially during the lettuce and cantaloupe harvest. However, by 1924, the US Congress had ended the exemption to the ban on contract laborers that it had enacted during World War I to address labor shortages. The agency's plan to supply the Imperial Valley with workers was therefore an obvious violation of US law. By October 1924, Walter E. Carr, District Director of Immigration stationed in Los Angeles, defended the Mexicali Labor Bureau's existence. Carr argued Mexicali's town council established the agency for, quote, the express purpose of providing employment and encouraging labor to remain in Baja California, end quote. The agency's goal was to recruit workers from the interior of Mexico. Mexicali's growers would fund those efforts, much like Liera's 1920 contract labor system. Carr recognized that in the past, Mexican workers had perhaps crossed into the United States, but he noted that he had recently sent an additional force of Border Patrol inspectors to the Imperial Valley. The district director believed that these increased patrols would discourage unauthorized entries by making them more hazardous. Carr pointed to the large collection of head tax fees as both evidence of the Border Patrol's success and that the Mexicali Labor Bureau was not actually sending workers into the United States. However, the employment agency had planned to pay for workers' head tax fees from the fees it collected from employers. The increase in head tax fees was not evidence of successful increased patrols. Instead, it suggested the Mexicali's Labor Bureau, with the financial support of Imperial Valley growers, successfully circumvented U.S. immigration and labor laws that banned contract labor. The actions of Mexicali's local government and District Director Carr's cast Mexicans in Mexicali as a sort of supply depot for American growers in the Imperial Valley. Arnulfo Liera, the organizer and head of Mexicali's contract labor system, would articulate similar views testifying before the California Department of Agriculture in 1920, in a meeting that was meant to discuss a cotton quarantine. Liera described the relationship between Mexicali and Calexico as one of commerce moving freely across borders. Mexicali agriculturalists exported cotton into the United States, and manufacturing goods from the valley often found their way into Baja California. But Liera made a most curious remark when he described the interdependence of the border region. He described Mexicali as, quote, the ranch headquarters for Imperial Valley, end quote. Liera believed Mexicali existed to supply the ranch companies. While Liera never directly discussed laborers in his testimony, by that time his company boats had transported 2,879 workers from Baja California Sur into the Northern District, many of whom crossed into the United States. When the Era discussed Mexicali as a supply store for the Imperial Valley, he knew workers were part of that supply chain. In his defense of the 1926 Passbook Plan, I.F. Wixson argued that shielding ranches from continual raids by immigration officials was quote, not doing violence to the law. Wixson defended immigration services in Colloquium and the Imperial Valley, arguing that they were, quote, at present in better standing than they had been for some time past, end quote. He believed that not only would U.S. immigration inspectors enforce the law in the future, but that, quote, at the same time maintain harmonious relations with the public, end quote. After proposing and defending his Passbook Plan, Wixson believed that the cycle of enforcing U.S. immigration law through deportation raids targeting Mexican agricultural workers had ended. Instead, when he argued the Imperial Valley agents would enforce the laws, he meant the growers' vision of the border, immigration, and law. However, agricultural workers and Imperial Valley residents' discussion of Mexicans, the border, and their attempt to create one big community between Calexico and Mexicali hid the very manufactured conditions that led to Mexicans crossing the border. It was not mere happenstance. Throughout the 1920s, agricultural industries in both California and northern Baja California built, supported, and maintained a transnational contract labor system that fed Mexican workers to the region. The 1926 Passbook Plan was just the next step in a process of continual legal innovation meant to create the contract labor system by another name. Thank you.
Thank you, Erik. All right, so our third presenter today is Michael Weeks. Michael's currently a lecturer in the history department at Utah Valley University, where he teaches courses on the modern U.S., environmental history, Utah history, and the American West. He's published articles on science and the state, irrigation engineering and public lands, and he's putting the finishing touches on his first book, which is titled Industrializing Place, Colorado and the Making of Agriculture in the 20th Century, which will be published by University of Nebraska Press. And if all goes as planned, it should be available by spring of 2022, 1 year. He lives in Provo, Utah, and he wanted me to let you know that he lives with his wife, Sasha, and his dog, Sienna, and he describes himself as, quote, a flailing backyard gardener who would desperately like to replace the rest of his lawn with something he can eat, close quote. And that's a nice lead directly into his talk today, which is titled Unexpected Relationships, the Agroecology of Immigrant Labor in the Northern Colorado Sugar Beet Fields of the 1920s and 1930s.
Right. Thank you, Erik, and thank you, Jennifer, for putting together the conference. Thank you for my co-panelists, and I appreciate all of you all that showed up today. So I have to also apologize because Erik gave the title of the book project I'm working on, and it is quite wonky. I'm working on it, and if all goes well, you will see a different title next year in the spring.
Very common, not unusual.
All right. So what you're seeing here is a picture of my backyard garden, and that's where we're going to start. So I am a gardener who takes risks with nature. Each year I try to plant a little earlier, hoping that winter frosts are done and that I can coax new plants past the gauntlet of rain and fungus and disease without injury. I've done things like try to grow Mediterranean crops in the Intermountain West and failed many times. But regardless of outcome, I alone take the risks and again, the rewards and disappointments that go along with those kinds of choices. Okay. By contrast, in production agriculture, though, output and risk are entangled. While industrialized agriculture seeks to rationalize nature, the vagaries of water, weather, wind, pest, disease, soil, you name it, in the market, they render those goals precarious. So historically, we got to ask how the burdens of nature's unpredictability were born. And who bore those burdens? To varying degrees, contracts between corporations, growers, and field laborers assigned burdens that included responsibility for the success or failure of a crop, unforeseen pest infestations, weather, and the risk of injury. This paper operates at the intersection of environmental risk and field labor in the sugar beet fields of northern Colorado during the 1920s. I show how the contract labor system employed there went beyond an exchange of productive labor for monetary compensation. In very visceral ways, the materiality of sugar beet labor presented a series of risks, some of which could be negotiated, while others were written into worker contracts. I focus on the relationship between field laborers and the growers. So I am going to skip through the historiography part for the sake of time, but let me just point out that much of my theoretical framing comes from the work of these three and others who have argued in the last 2 to 3 decades that historians of agriculture, environment, and capitalism need to focus more on modes of production, and specifically capitalist modes of production, and how they interact with the kind of production that takes place in agricultural sites. And how, in some cases, even that agroecology, that ecology of farm production, operated within and involved the workers themselves. So the map that you're seeing is the northern Colorado beet sugar industry during the 1920s. And during the 1920s, northern Colorado led the nation in sugar production. Surprise, surprise. One company, Great Western Sugar, monopolized the region's processing capacity. Growers either farmed their own land or rented it from owners. On average, the company employed about 30,000 contract laborers to complete the thinning, the cultivation, and the harvesting needed to move beets from seed to factory. Most field workers were either Hispanos from southern Colorado and northern New Mexico, or Mexican nationals. From April through November, 2 out of every 3 human hours required to move beets from seed to harvest were performed by laborers such as the ones that you see here. Consequently, the nature of beet agroecology was inscribed within, I believe, their sensual experiences and their mental geographies. Take their experience of water and soil, for example. During the thinning season, which coincided with the highest annual rainfall in this region, water falling from clouds above and percolating from the earth below dictated the labor possibilities. Families often labored in thick clay mud that attached itself to the shoe soles and the hoe blades, adding to the physical toll of walking, stooping, and kneeling. Laborers often emerged from a long day caked in mud, and the practical economics of mud were left to the male head of the household who made daily decisions about field labor, while the extra burden of restoring the field utility of clothing fell to adult women. Moisture also attracted mosquito populations to wet fields and human sweat, prompting workers to cover their faces and their necks. While the dry weather of July and August thinned mosquito population, irrigation then tended to replenish it. But dry conditions also generated their own problems. During weeding operations, Saul Sanchez complained that, quote, the soil was so hard and the weeds were so thick that the hoe bounced right back when it hit the dirt, adding to labor's physical toll. Freezing and thawing water required endurance and care as well. The first frost of the season coincided, generally speaking, with the beet harvests. During early morning hours, topping of the beets required extra care because icy beets conspired with sharp knives and sometimes rusty ones like the one you see here, causing injuries to knees and limbs. As the day progressed, then the ice would melt and soaking workers from the knees down. One witness observed that women were, quote, wet up to their waists and have ice in their laps and on their underwear. The visceral connection between bodies and soils bore out the relationship between sugar beets and field labor. Amidst the environmental burdens of field work, laborers sought to better their conditions. Returning contract laborers quickly learned that they could be selective in who they worked for. They evaluated farmers' fields, often bypassing a weedy field or one that had been poorly plowed. This was no small thing, since the typical beet field contained 5 miles of rows, and a family of 5 would tend to contract to thin, cultivate, and harvest 30 to 50 acres over the course of the season. So the size of an acre mattered. Moreover, while some growers cheated workers by misrepresenting the size of each acre, the process could work in reverse. Laborers used their own methods to measure the fields and then negotiated their pay for more acreage that sometimes was actually there. Housing, of course, was another critical site of contestation. While some laborers rented or owned houses away from the beet fields, the long hours made it essential for workers to live in grower-owned housing for much of the season, sort of on site. Growers were required to provide housing as part of the contract. By the 1920s, houses were a mix of what were derogatorily referred to as beet shacks, and then any other number of more modest kinds of arrangements, all the way up to small cottages. The most common shack, like you see here, was 14 by 20, 336 square feet of living space, 2 rooms, one that functioned as a kitchen, a dining room, and a living area, and the other was intended for the entire family to sort of sleep in and otherwise operate in. Growers enclosed shacks on all sides, cut 2 windows, laid rudimentary wood plank floors, and constructed tar paper roofs. Growers situated beet shacks, of course, adjacent to their fields. And since growers used flood irrigation, insects, of course, like I pointed out earlier, such as mosquitoes, were quite common. Of course, though, savvy beet workers avoided these beet shacks, like the one you see here, prioritizing physical distance from fields, screened and sealed windows and doors, and access to water uncontaminated by the pests who were endemic to the beet sugar industry. Thus, while field work blurred the lines between human and non-human organisms, workers sought bodily separation when they weren't laboring. As laborers negotiated their exposure to nature's elements, Great Western and its growers protected their economic interests by employing contract language that exposed workers to nature's idiosyncrasies. Contract stated that when any phase of cultivation was not completed in a timely fashion, growers could then hire extra labor to complete the unfinished tasks and then charge the costs against the wages of the contract laborer. Consequently, factors such as mud and frozen ground were not just environmental hardships, they could be economic ones as well. The greatest risk assumed by hand laborers was at harvest, when the company and its growers tried to cheat nature by harvesting beets later into the season when frost danger increased, similar to kind of the things I was doing in my own garden. When the weather cooperated, the gamble paid dividends to growers and Great Western. However, when it did not, the corporation and its growers scrambled to hire extra workers, offloading the extra costs onto the laborers. While nature could not entirely be rationalized, some of the financial burdens of nature could be. No year illustrates this better than 1929. That year, Colorado growers contracted to plant record acreage. This, combined with a decrease in the supply of resident and migrant laborers, led Great Western Sugar to seek workers in the Southwest and across the border into Mexico. Hand laborers that year agreed to cultivate fields at a rate of $23 per acre. When warm weather held out in early October, the company and its growers, well, they delayed the harvest in hopes of reaping windfall profits. Meanwhile, laborers who were typically not paid until the very end of the season openly questioned the delay. When Great Western finally gave the green light to pull and top beets, the weather quickly turned. Alternating periods of rain and snow resulted in muddy fields, miserable workers, and of course, a halting harvest. Then the weather turned particularly cold, frigid enough to freeze unharvested beets into the earth. Since beet roots possess a deep tap root that extends as much as 3 feet into the ground, as you can see here from the picture, excavating and topping beets proceeded then at a snail's pace. Moreover, because cold temperatures also reduced sugar content, growers in Great Western were in a panic to remove them. So of course, they scrambled to hire whatever additional labor they could find, even releasing some prisoners in local jails to work in the harvest. Due to the terms of their contract, the environmental and economic costs fell heavily onto laborers. One hand laborer stated that he was supposed to receive $154 for harvesting 14 acres, yet he had to pay out $70 for additional labor, and he still had 3 acres left to harvest before he would get paid. Due to what one labor advocate called, quote, technical clauses contained within worker contracts, the fallout from the greed and environmental hubris of Great Western and its growers fell heavily onto laborers. With large quantities of beets unharvested, most laborers were not compensated even their reduced wages until after they harvested every last beet. On occasion, this did not occur until January. Some laborers were not paid at all. In response, many workers filed wage claims with their Beet Workers Association, which was an arm of the American Federation of Labor. This is a list of some of their claims. An incomplete list of these claims from 41 laborers in one beet district documented $7,300 in unpaid wages. In Weld County, those who applied for relief from public agencies were often ignored, leaving many to seek the help of philanthropic organizations. Those who left northern Colorado for the winter, residing seasonally in Denver or smaller towns such as Pueblo, tried to obtain relief funds from the city and from Catholic charities. Those funds quickly drained. As for Mexican nationals who possessed the least recourse against their employers, many were faced with the choice of returning to Mexico without pay or pursuing uncertain wage claims. Their quandary, of course, was as they were pursuing their wage claims, many of them were still living on the same land of those who refused to pay their wages. So after being evicted from those homes, some then turned to the Mexican consulate for financial assistance to return to Mexico. At the end of the 1929 season, the consulate aided 325 families returning home. And when Great Western Sugar and its growers paid for their 1929 harvest time decisions with a smaller harvest, they rationalized their decisions through contracts and practices that placed environmental burdens on the shoulders of laborers. The example of sugar beet workers in northern Colorado during the 1920s demonstrates that field work extended beyond the mere exchange of work for money. Their labors were deeply entwined in the constructed agroecology of sugar beet agriculture. It was inscribed in the bodies of laborers and in their homes. I argue that, in conclusion, we should do more work to interrogate the spaces where the agroecology of work environments intersect with the interests of the workers and their employers in the fields, such as in this case. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. All right, so our final presenter tonight is Jennifer Cullison, who did, I should say, the lion's share of the work of organizing this panel, and thank you for that. She is the director of the Realities of Undocumented Immigrants Oral History Project and a postdoctoral teaching fellow in the Core Humanities program at the University of Nevada, Reno. Received her PhD from the University of Colorado Boulder. Her research focuses on the response of immigrants to INS and ICE detention policy and practice in the post-war era. And her presentation today is titled INS Depictions of Mexican Detainees versus Realities of Confinement and Resistance in South Texas during Operation Wetback, 1942 to 1964. Jennifer.
Hi, thank you for that introduction. Can somebody give me a thumbs up that you can hear me? Cool. Okay, so that's the Mcallen detention camp. We'll look at this picture several times, but let's go ahead and Look at the rest of this. Okay, so upon opening of the quote unquote alien detention camp in Mcallen, Texas in 1953, Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS officials announced, quote, "It is significant that the care and the treatment provided for those who are detained in this camp a few hours or overnight is more wholesome and sanitary, and the food more nutritious and ample than many have ever known before, undoubtedly better than the living accommodations made available by many of those who employ illegal labor. The social and economic implications of the contrast are sharply etched in the Mcallen operation." Unquote. As INS officials authorized the opening of various detention facilities through the post-war era, they often claimed, as here, that they provided detainees satisfactory and even pleasant conditions of confinement. Yet words did little to hide the dehumanizing caging project that the US INS officials launched with Operation Wetback that year and subsequent detention and deportation efforts in South Texas. Despite evidence of abuse, INS officials held on to and promoted a rosy image of service detention in the area as it became increasingly important in enforcement operations. The real contrast, sharply etched in INS enforcement, at least in South Texas, lay between what the service claimed and what the detainees experienced. The Rio Grande Valley, the RGV, the southernmost section of South Texas, had long been a gateway region for migration between the US and Mexico. Agricultural opportunities in the area surrounding the more notable cities of Brownsville, Los Fresnos, Harlingen, and Mcallen attracted seasonal migration laborers to help produce cotton, citrus fruits, and grapes, among other products. With the beginning of the Bracero Guest Worker Program in 1942, Texan planters had a chance to legally hire unprecedented numbers of Mexican migrant laborers. Mexico, however, initially excluded Texas from the program due to widespread discrimination against Mexicans there. Though Texas's Good Neighbor Commission eventually aided in addressing the discrimination and thus paved the way for braceros to sign contracts with Texan growers by 1947, the Texan planters still preferred hiring undocumented workers. By the late 1940s then, there were more undocumented Mexicans than braceros crossing the US-Mexican border, and many of the former were in the RGV. Due in part to its rocky start with the Bracero program and the resulting flow of undocumented workers, the Brownsville borderlands section of the RGV became second only to San Diego in migrant traffic. Early on, the Mexican government, with a desire to keep its non-braceros home, actually had requested that the US government step up its border patrol. Accordingly, over the first decade of the Bracero program until 1954, especially in Texas and California, the border patrol apprehended up to 7 times as many undocumented migrants as there were braceros, almost all of whom were then Mexicans. Once they had undocumented Mexican migrants in their custody, Border Patrol officers returned them to their homes by deportation or voluntary departure, the latter being available to those without records of criminal or immigration code violations and who could afford their own passage home. Undocumented Mexicans who lived in northern Mexico were bused to the border and released. Given the long history of undocumented workers crossing there, Border Patrol and detention centers in the lower RGV became vital in the US INS deportation projects of the early 1950s. This was especially true for Operation Wetback, led by INS Commissioner Joseph Swing between 1953 and 1954. As Kelly Lytle Hernandez explains, the Border Patrol had used the South Texas area of Port Isabel, Los Fresnos, and San Benito in their 1950 pilot raid programs, including mobile immigration stations and detention centers, 1 plane, 1 truck, 1 carryall, 2 buses, and 9 automobiles. South Texas remained a focal point of the operation when it finally went full scale in 1953 with Operation Wetback. At first, massive INS apprehension and removal efforts did not usually involve holding cells and/or detention camps. Until the early 1950s, INS had been running detention and deportation from large Border Patrol stations such as this here in Mcallen. Though as early as 1944, INS officials in Washington, D.C. had been considering a large camp in South Texas for detention. Until 1953, INS officers there used only these stations. But even as the largest Border Patrol station in the RGV since 1938, the Mcallen station had maybe 2 holding cells. So after Border Patrol agents processed migrants for deportation there, guards supervised crowds in the parking lots for same-day transportation to the border. Through the 1940s and the early 1950s, with very limited overnight detention space, Border Patrol officers in the RGV also sometimes contracted with county jails to further detention space. Expanded efforts to forcibly relocate undocumented Mexican migrants who were residents of central and southern Mexico began to change the situation of immigrant detention in South Texas. First, with the cooperation of the Mexican government, sporadic train lifts began from Nogales and El Paso into the interior of Mexico in 1945. Then in 1951, daily airlifts from Brownsville and Huntsville, California began. And in 1953, INS officials added boat lifts to the deportation schematic, with Port Isabel serving as a gathering point for trips to Veracruz and Tampico, Mexico. At this juncture, INS operations required significantly more space to allow for removal operations in South Texas, including processing, detaining, and moving migrants to various lifts. With their potential to deport more migrants back to Mexico in a single trip than any other means of deportation, the introduction of boat lifts that year profoundly influenced the growth of INS detention. In coordination with the bus, train, boat, and airlifts, and as part of the buildup for Operation Wetback, INS administrators selected Mcallen for a detention site. In 1952, they commenced construction, intending to have a maximum capacity of 1,000 people or persons. Opening on March 6, 1953, with an initial overnight capacity of only 640, the Mcallen facility very quickly accommodated and averaged a daytime transfer capacity of 1,000. In early 1954, after INS officials coordinated expansion, it could detain up to 2,000 people overnight. As Operation Wetback wrapped up in 1954, then the Mcallen facility detained a good portion of the 500,000 plus detained people nationwide that year by the INS. Indeed, unlike the Chula Vista and El Centro sites in California, which had capacities of just 400 and 500 respectively, with its overnight capacity of 2,000 by 1954 and its 11-acre campus, Mcallen became the largest INS detention center of the time. The new facilities further institutionalized detention in the area, both physically and administratively. Border Patrol officers would no longer need to corral deportees in fields, Border Patrol processing centers, and Border Patrol parking lots, as had previously been the modus operandi. Detainee barracks were actually recycled World War II victory huts. These huts had no glass windows, were actually made of plywood and canvas, and were intended for use for no more than 5 years. According to this photographic evidence, the full configuration of the camp in 1956 included more than 40 victory huts, housing perhaps 24 bunk beds each, at least 2 large outdoor metal shaded canopies, concertina wire fencing, and 5 observation towers along the perimeter. Though with these huts, a dining hall, kitchen, and even soda vending machines, the camp appeared to offer the basics. These were far inferior to other INS operations. At half the capacity of the largest World War II camp for quote unquote alien enemies detention, Crystal City, which had a capacity of 4,000, the site at Mcallen lacked the amenities of its predecessor. First, unlike Crystal City, which ultimately had basic cottages, Mcallen had only victory huts for its tenure. Because most detainees were at the camp for a night, there were also no school facilities for the children, nor were there any swimming pools or sporting fields. Yet, all the way from Washington, D.C., the INS promoted this, its next generation of detention camps, in terms similar to those used for the World War II alien enemy camps. A veteran chief detention officer of Crystal City, as well as various post-war displaced persons camps in Europe, Bern Berard, had been serving as chief of the detention branch in Washington, D.C. since at least the early 1950s. Upon visiting South Texas INS detention camps in 1954, she remarked that the facilities were, quote unquote, very good. She explained, quote, illegal entrants from Mexico who are in this country breaking our laws are treated humanely and with the utmost fairness. This has come to be associated with the American democracy, unquote. Her assessment, however, conveniently overlooked the carceral conditions of the camp. First, at least in Mcallen, massive INS detention created a basic tension with the idea of administrative holds as different and more humane than criminal incarceration. The site plan itself was more like a prison than a mere set of dormitories, much as the US internment camps for war-era Japanese, Germans, and Italians must be understood as carceral with the restrictive fencing, guard towers, and patrols. So too did the new mass detention projects of 1950s defy the INS Rosie ideal. Then that INS officials chose to reserve a section of this site for US Marshal, or later as we know it, US Marshal Service or USMS inmates, in fact, contradicted any claims of humane administration. Plans for such interagency agreement to house non-immigrant prisoners on part of the Mcallen property began early. As explained in the 1953 INS annual report, quote, due to the fact that all jails are overcrowded along the Mexican border, the service has assisted US Marshals wherever possible in Lower California and in the Imperial Valley by holding United States prisoners and in its detention facilities. This assistance will be expanded to include portions of the Mcallen camp for that purpose, unquote. Though the US Marshal only sent pretrial prisoners, those charged for immigration violations and those with shorter sentences to that portion of the Mcallen site, the implications stand out today. It was apparently normal for administrators in the Department of Justice to merge the policies and practices of immigration control and criminal justice. The choice of shared carceral space, even in 1953, suggested first that officials in the DOJ saw little difference between administrative INS detainees, pretrial detainees, and those serving shorter sentences, as long as they all required only minimal security. It also suggested that to the various administrators, migrant detainees could be subjected to the same standards as criminal inmates. This choice provided an early signal of the need for differentiated standards for immigrant detention. It would be 3 more decades, however, before the first attempt at such standards would be made. The fact that the Mcallen camp also served as a federal prison annex was lined with restrictive fencing, dotted with makeshift and deteriorating huts, and patrolled by guards, clearly challenged any claim that Mcallen demonstrated the service's humanity. INS executives in Washington, D.C., however, still pointed to what they saw as improved conditions for migrant laborers. Yet the use of victory huts would suggest that plumbing, sanitation, dining, and sleeping conditions may have been rudimentary at best and trying at worst. Further, even before the Department of Labor forced higher living conditions on bracero contractors, the use of victory huts and outhouses would not have been exactly an improvement for most agricultural laborers, especially since most lived in similar scenarios in the Rio Grande Valley. Extending at least through the early 1960s, humane care and treatment at Mcallen may not always have been the case either. Certainly most migrants would spend only minimal time detained before removal by bus, train, boat, or airlift. Although their experience remains largely missing from available US government archives, evidence suggests that conditions at the Mcallen site were troubling. One source from the acting officer in charge of the site, A.D. Brandon, reveals that until late 1955, in other words, through all of Operation Wetback, most of the men detained at the Mcallen camp slept on the cement floor or the ground outside their huts. According to one of Berard's reports, this was because soon after the camp's opening, some men had purposely broken or refused to use provided cots, instead opting for the ground. Shortly after this, the camp administrators had the cots removed from the men's area, apparently as a preventative measure, if not a disciplinary one. Women, however, continued to use the cots. It took a full year, though, to arrange just 200 beds to replace the cots for the prisoners, and another year to have enough beds for all expected immigrant detainees as well. In the meantime, many slept on the ground, and the INS reports reveal that in 1954, when there were still not enough beds for the 2,000 person capacity, the Mcallen camp overnight population reached one night 6,400 people. In other words, serious overcrowding. Two other INS sources admit that detainees at the Mcallen camp in 1954 and 1955 spoke unfavorably of their experiences of detention and deemed their time there worse than the boat lift itself. One officer stated that every one of the migrants on a boat lift to Veracruz in 1955, quote, expressed themselves as greatly disliking their time spent in the detention camp, unquote. In addition to the problems with bedding and overcrowding, detainees likely felt uncomfortable with a lack of privacy in the bathrooms, if not elsewhere, and feeling like cattle being herded in large military trucks and buses between detention sites and deportation points. But further evidence suggests that INS officers had not managed humane operations. In 1953, a letter written by Texas resident Luis A. Garcia provides some idea of the trouble. He alerted Governor Shivers of mistreatment at the Mcallen camp. He says, I have taken many persons who have been roughly handled, slapped, and even kicked and beaten by Border Patrol guards. He has talked to them, sorry. I have seen the marks of cowboy boot heels on man's backs. I have several witnesses who will testify that their personal property, such as lighters, knives, pens, and pencils, have been taken from them in the detention center at Mcallen. This is a blotch on the great state of Texas. It must be erased before I again feel pride in being a Texan. Garcia expressed concern that Border Patrol guards at the Mcallen Border Patrol camp had been treating undocumented Mexicans unfairly just as Operation Wetback was beginning. Early in that process, he had already heard of mistreatment, including physical abuse and excessive confiscation. His words suggested that management at the Mcallen camp was a problematic site, or that the camp itself was a problematic site of incarceration and surveillance. Consideration of evidence as above suggests too that the site may not have been entirely free of physical abuse and therefore not necessarily the haven of humane treatment alluded to in the INS literature. Mexican women detained at the Mcallen detention camp had unique difficulties as well, though most accounts of the Bracero program and Operation Wetback assume that Mexican men made up the entirety of the labor and deportation stream, and despite July 1954 memos directing Mcallen personnel from detaining women, children, and the disabled, records and archival photos confirm that the INS also apprehended and detained Mexican women and children at Mcallen and elsewhere. Border Patrol agents in Corpus Christi, for example, sent undocumented women and children to the home of Stella Luna before their deportations in the 1940s and 1950s. At the Mcallen camp, INS officers detained women and children in segregated women's areas. As a large camp, Mcallen certainly had a corps of detention officers and quote unquote matrons. According to INS detention policy, matrons supervised detained women and children and escorted deportees, with matrons providing at least the semblance of gender designated protection and care. Perhaps many women and children felt somewhat insulated from aggressions by male Border Patrol officers, detention officers, and detainees, but given the possibility of mistreatment overall, gender segregation in the presence of matrons could not fully assure those women concerned for their safety. Indeed, like the men who in 1953 destroyed and rejected their cots, the women at the Mcallen camp probably felt abused and dehumanized, that they at one point, quote, defaced the walls with lipstick, unquote, might have suggested not that they were, as Berard thought, quote, irresponsible people, unquote, needing INS lessons in discipline and hygiene, but that these women had serious problems or concerns about their incarceration. The traces of the women's resistance and Berard's disdainful reaction to them, in fact, fully contradict the humanitarian claims of the INS at the time. The facade of humanitarian treatment persisted, however. In 1954, 5 months after Joseph Swing had completed the core of Operation Wetback, Attorney General Herbert Brownell announced plans for downsizing INS detention with a liberal parole policy. The plan offered hope of a new humanitarian age by stressing the closure of INS detention centers, including Ellis Island, that year, and thus leaving only one permanent detention center, El Centro, on the Mexico border. Despite Brownell's promise, the Mcallen camp persisted a few more years and ultimately left a sizable mark on the history of the INS. By 1960, deterioration of the huts had progressed so far that INS administrators tried and failed to win funds to replace them. The camp closed the next year. To take its place, just some 60 miles east, the INS opened the Port Isabel Detention Center, a brick and mortar, fully carceral facility that had grown to become one of the largest of its kind today. Less than a decade after Brownell's claim of humanitarian enforcement, the INS promise rang hollow. What the archives actually revealed then is that INS officials' treatment of Mexican migrants at Mcallen in the 1950s had laid much of the punitive roots of the U.S. immigration enforcement regime today.
Thank you, Jennifer. All right, so first I want to thank all the presenters for writing 4 excellent papers on the history of labor migration and restriction in North America. My goal on my comments today is to identify what I believe to be each paper's central and most significant argument and contribution. And I absolutely encourage them to correct me if I get this wrong. And then to bring presenters' work into conversation with one another and allow presenters to respond directly. Or, since we're getting short on time, perhaps my comments will just stimulate good critical thinking and questions from the audience. So first, I want to observe that all the papers emphasize that borders that were established by the US, Canadian, Mexican governments in the mid-19th century became meaningful only gradually. And as Patrick Lozar put it in his discussion of indigenous Salish people in British Columbia and Washington, in incremental ways. In Patrick's presentation, these governments also simultaneously established new borders in the form of reservations, and then declared that members of different Salish bands were either American Indians or Canadian Indians, and enforced these delineations with new technologies of surveillance. And yet, the policing that had intended to reorient these groups remained incomplete, at least into the early decades of the 20th century. Salish men, women, and children adapted old migration patterns across the new international border, adapting them to the commercial agricultural economy while asserting their own identities as distinct nations. Families pooled their wages. Some would remain well after the season was over to stay with relatives or even form new kinship bonds through marriage. And he ultimately argues that while these agricultural industries were not of their creation, Salish migrations followed older economic, social, and migration patterns, and that their migrations undermine the line's meaning as a marker of nation-state space, while reinforcing transborder community. Erik Bernardino begins with a somewhat similar observation about a different border, the US-Mexico border between the two Californias. And he opens with the story of how Chief Inspector Irving Wixson observed in 1926, as he put it, that the border did not exist in the Imperial and Mexicali valleys, and it did as it did in other places. Wixson was initially determined to enforce U.S. immigration laws, but then he came to recognize the demand for Mexican farm workers in the Imperial Valley. He did not, however, understand that local officials in Mexicali and Calexico had worked out their own mechanisms to ensure a ready and tractable labor supply. Erik seeks to revise other historians' findings that the late 1920s was the start of a hard border era, as he puts it. And instead of arguing that national governments impose new methods of policing and migration management, he sees a more complex relationship, in which international, national, and local level stakeholders continued to collaborate in an already existing cross-border labor system that became the regional engine of immigration policy. thinking about Erik and Patrick's papers in conversation with one another, it's hard not to notice that while Erik emphasizes the voluntary nature of Salish labor migrations, which allowed indigenous people to reinforce community, Erik emphasizes the way that padrones, business owners, and other stakeholders sought to control the movement of people across the border. And perhaps this is an overly obvious question, or these are overly obvious questions, but is this a distinction reflective of a difference in the degree to which the two borders were policed? Or perhaps it was simply a difference in timing, in which Patrick focuses largely on the period preceding 1920, while Erik focuses on the 1920s, this period when borders were supposed to harden, or start to harden. And I'd also like to ask Patrick, while you emphasize continuities in indigenous practices in your presentation, how did new borders surveillance technologies and what I imagine, as Michael has talked about, was backbreaking, difficult, and low-paid work, affect the Salish communities perhaps in negative ways? How free was their movement across the border? And then I might ask Erik whether he found that migrant workers in the Mexicali, Calexico region formed their own trans-border communities and networks beyond the watchful eyes of growers, businesses, and government that could become the basis for resisting exploitation, or at least preserving autonomous cultural spaces. And did the actions ever force the hand of border officials to revise their policies, as we've seen in some other cases today? While Patrick focuses on indigenous trans-border migrants and Erik focuses on employers, local government officials, and trans-border recruitment and enforcement, Michael views migrant labor through a very different lens, arguing that scholars need to interrogate spaces where the agroecology of work environments intersects with the interests of workers and employers. And he demonstrates a specific kind of migrant labor, sugar beet cultivation in northern Colorado, made all the difference in the experience of workers and their relationships to their employers. Growers employed Hispano migrants from nearby southern Colorado and northern New Mexico and Mexican national families alike. They employed a patriarchal system in which they paid male heads of household to thin, cultivate, and harvest by the acre, rather than other crops which were harvested and paid by the hour or the day or by weight. And that through this seasonal cycle, the ground would turn to mud, to hard earth, to ice, and back, with men making the daily decisions about their wives and their children's labor. And then employers, because of the nature of this labor and of the environment, could try to cheat their workers by misrepresenting acreage, and laborers could turn that tactic right back on the growers. Jennifer's research is more similar to that, I think, of Erik's, in that she turns her attention back to a system of government-regulated labor recruitment and migration enforcement. Her focus on Texas, however, is situated about a quarter century later, and we see how two national governments, especially one national government, rather than local actors, work to control migration and detain and deport unsanctioned migrants. Federal immigration officials claim that the Bracero program and soon thereafter the construction of detention centers were humanitarian efforts, and claim that their methods were a major improvement over less organized, older strategies to manage trans-border labor migration. And yet the detention center at the town of Mcallen, a place that's been in the news a great deal over the past few years, betrayed a harsher reality. Male and female migrants and their children were housed alongside prisoners in a facility that was reminiscent of World War II era internment camps, with guard towers, restrictive fencing, etc. And detainees also faced overcrowding and abuse by Border Patrol agents. Altogether, she argues, INS officials' treatment of Mexican migrants in Mcallen in the 1950s laid much of the punitive roots for U.S. enforcement today. And her work did make me think about someone she mentioned, Kelly Lytle Hernandez's book Migra. Though Hernandez argues that the close of Operation Wetback in the midst of the Bracero program in the mid-1950s marked the dawn of the carceral era. And it seems that, Jennifer, you might be pushing the beginning of that carceral era back into the 1940s, at least in Texas. And then I also think about Erik's work on the California borderlands, a period that was followed, he's focusing on the 1920s, a period that was followed by the repatriations of the 30s, and have to ask whether the Texas system of the 40s and 50s was really the foundation for the modern enforcement system, or whether there's more continuity than discontinuity from earlier practices. On another topic, both Michael and Patrick's work suggest, or at least strongly imply, I think Michael especially suggests, but so does Patrick, that we should focus more on the motivations and experiences of migrants themselves, not solely on employers and government officials. And this reminds me, too, of the work of Deborah Cohen, who argues that braceros were invested in the belief that they might be able to serve their roles as proper patriarchs, and who made their own worlds and fought for rights and made demands of growers, Mexican officials, and U.S. state employees, to affect the nature of the Bracero program. As she puts it, their relationship as migrant laborers to two nation states was, quote, not merely imposed by the state from the top down, but was constructed from the bottom up in a dialectical process. And then finally, Michael takes us in another direction, saying we need to talk about the visceral relationship between migrants, employers, and agroecologies to truly understand why and how the migrant labor system developed in the way it did. Then I'll just end by asking, are these all simply differences between equally legitimate research priorities, different time periods, regions, borders, and migrant populations, ranging from indigenous people to Mexican nationals to Hispanos? Or are there disagreements over the best way forward for scholars to better understand, to quote the title of this panel, U.S. immigration and labor policy during the age of restriction? And I'll end on that note. And I think rather than ask you guys to actually respond immediately to my questions, because there's not much time, although I think we probably can afford to go over, because it's not like there's another panel scheduled right after this in this room. I'll first ask if someone in the audience wants to follow up with their own questions. I see a thank you from Priscilla. And she asks if I could expand a bit more on my categorization of, this is for you, Erik Bernardino. If you could expand a bit more on your categorization, peopling of Mexican workers. Who was included in this category and who was not? How much of the movements and networks across Californias were part of a greater migration across Mexico? Chinese and Japanese Mexican agricultural workers living and toiling in Baja California del Norte and the forming Imperial Valley come to mind. Any added context would be appreciated. So, Erik, to you.
That's a hefty question. So I'm going to try and address it point by point. The first, the question of the Chinese and Japanese Mexicans, the work of Freddy Gonzalez comes immediately to mind in terms of Chinese Mexicans in this region. The thing that I find interesting about that is, so there's a report, I forget the exact year, that sort of tries to compare the Chinese labor system of organizing labor with that of the Mexicans. And the report finds, this is a California politician, finds that the Chinese system is better because they're more efficient and better organized. And so the Chinese contract labor system is preferred to the Mexican labor at the time. And this is a couple years, I think this is in 1915. And so the Chinese are sort of here present And the other interesting thing about that, and to sort of Erik's earlier comment about transborder communities, one of the things that's happening on the Mexicali side is there's a tension between Mexican nationals and Chinese, because Chinese own so much of the land. And in 1922, actually, there is a strike that happens across Mexicali and the Imperial Valley. And part of what happens is that Japanese and Chinese purchase a large amount of land in Mexicali. And that sort of is I argue that that's sort of the onus of this strike, rather than what happens on the US side of the border. And so to the peopling of Mexican worker, I'm in this paper, I'm sort of looking just as agricultural workers, but in my larger project, I really focus on two categories of workers, sex workers and agricultural workers, and that way to sort of both inject some different perspectives on what we think of as labor, and also to give some context to the Mexican worker and who exactly it is that I'm talking about.
Thanks, Erik. Anyone else have questions? And if not, feel free, panel members, to respond to anything I said, or just tell me I'm, don't know what I'm talking about and didn't understand anything any of you said. All right, neither.
I actually have a question for Jennifer.
Great, Michael.
And I think, I love that picture that you had, that black and white sort of almost film noir looking picture of the detention camp in Mcallen with the circular barbed wire and that kind of thing. And then you went exactly where I was going, which was connecting that with Japanese incarceration during World War II. And I'm thinking, and then some of this larger conversation around the border, or around these spaces, is the militarization of the border. And I'm wondering if in the built space there you found any connection between the building up of Mcallen for incarceration of migrants and the use of the methods and styles and what have you used by the War Relocation Authority and others to incarcerate Japanese Americans during World War II. Did you find any kind of, obviously, I mean, the connection is in the picture, but I'm wondering if you found those connections in your research as well.
I think people who have been looking at the history of detention centers have found that one crossover between World War II alien enemy camps and other camps for Japanese Americans, they had the materials that I was talking about, right? The victory huts could be used at some of these internment centers. Those would be used briefly, like at Crystal City, and then replaced with things that were more permanent. But I believe, according to Jessica Ordaz, who now is at CU Boulder, she has done similar research in Southern California about El Centro, and I think El Centro also had recycled World War II Japanese internment camp materials that they used. So economically, there's this connection, right? This idea that INS is always underfunded, that's always their argument. And so they put together these facilities in the most economical manner possible. But that's really mostly all that I've seen. Like, and then, the recycling from the Navy, I didn't end up putting that there, but the beds came from the Navy. So there's just these frugal efforts, right, that are going on at the time. But really, one interesting thing about Operation Wetback, this huge roundup effort related to all those undocumented people coming during the Bracero program, was that there were discussions about whether or not that should be a military operation. But according to the Constitution, that is not something that is supposed to happen, right? We're not supposed to use the military for domestic purposes. So Joseph Swing and other officials at the time had this debate and came to this conclusion they're not supposed to do that. And yet of late in the last decades, right? Somehow the last administration decided that that's apparently not an issue anymore. So I don't know how that is happening now when it couldn't happen before. I mean, literally sending the military down to the border to be backup to all of these kinds of situations of people crossing the border. But yeah, so I saw that as part of your question too. I know you didn't directly ask that, but it's interesting how there's overlap between the different federal agencies.
Thank you. Yeah, it's probably relevant also to mention that the Border Patrol itself was involved in transporting Japanese Americans into the internment camps during World War II. Connection from the other angle. Elizabeth St. John talks about that.
Yes, some of them were run by the INS, and then some of them were by the War Relocation Authority. It depended whether or not they were considered, whether they were actually immigrants, or if they were and a threat, or if they were American born, right? There's also an interesting comment. Priscilla says that she's from Crystal City, and the Japanese internment camps buildings were repurposed as schoolhouses for Mexican migrant worker children well into the 70s. I saw that was the case in Utah too, with the one of the Japanese internment camps as well. Similar things, like they just sold off the buildings, and different nonprofits and different people just bought the houses, like a different and strange inner connectedness of these sorts of things. But to see that they were then used for Mexican migrant workers, it's irony. I'm not sure what you call that.
Yeah. Does anyone else want to have another question or want to respond or ask each other questions? We are 6 minutes over at this point. I think it's fair to go another 4 if you want to, but if not, we can also all go, grab a martini. We can't do it together. Be nice if we could. If this was actually the AHA. Could go out to dinner or something, but
it might be interesting to talk about. I don't know how many of you have looked into the ideas of what the age of restriction was, but I, in using that term for this panel, was using it very loosely because it's not generally considered to be as long as how I put that in place. But if anybody wants to talk about that, or to talk about cycles and all of this, I think that could be an interesting thing as well.
I did have I was going to ask that question. What do you define as the age of restriction? What period are we talking about?
I mean, across all of our papers, I would call that the age of restriction, right? Like, I think literally you could call it from the Chinese Exclusion Act all the way until 1965. Like, you could call that, I mean, depending on which population you're talking about, but I think you could call that the age of restriction, but other scholars wouldn't make it quite as long.
Yeah, and there's of course all kinds of new kinds of restrictions that have been in place since then, right? It's hard not to see the last 4 years as another age of restriction, in different form, but in a lot of ways that echo what we've seen before. Michael, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I wonder about this, Jennifer, because I'm thinking, like, during the 1930s, some of the laborers that I was talking about after the Jones-Costigan version of the AAA Act limited the amount of land that was used to be growing beets, and then of course so many Mexican nationals were expelled alongside many Mexican American citizens from northern Colorado. The governor of Colorado, a guy named Hiram Johnson, was trying to basically close the border using National Guard, but also the power of the state of Colorado. And I'm just thinking about where the state fits, 1930s deportation versus the place of the state, 1950s deportation. And the obvious place in between is, World War II, a pumped up sort of military, a larger apparatus, but maybe lessons learned from the 1930s that were applied to create a more systematic and harsh kind of deportation in the 1950s. Johnson was rebuked in the 1930s, but he did have some success, and certainly a lot of Coloradans kind of joined him as seeing Mexican Americans as sort of scapegoats for the Depression. So just kind of curious where those two periods would fit in our discussion. So.
I would add that in general, the Mexican repatriations that happened in the 1930s were not just in Colorado, but many states. Really, the majority of the people that were pushed into Mexico, Mexican Americans and Mexicans were pushed by local and state sources, right? The federal government was not really that involved in it. But the thing is that it wasn't really a lesson learned. I think that in the last several decades, there have always been local and state efforts to take on the federal government's job in terms of immigration management. And especially in Texas, there have been lots of cases of things like the county health officials deciding not to give birth certificates to Mexican people who had children there, not asking if they crossed the border that day or ever, right? Just deciding you look like you just got here, so I'm not giving you a birth certificate for your child, and so defeating the 14th Amendment and trying to implement their own version of federal law, right? So pushing people out or administratively deciding what the federal government should decide, like it has happened in the last years. It happened the last time I was down in Texas. That was still happening in 2017. It's probably still happening now. So yeah, as a nation, we go through these cycles, and the what was it? Not Minutemen. What was it called? The people in especially Arizona that were deciding to be their own little posse of Border Patrol.
You got it. So isn't it the Minutemen Defense Corps or something like that?
Yeah, right. And so this whole vigilante posse stuff that goes on too, we've not ever learned our lesson as a nation overall, I don't think.
Well, and Erik, you were showing that it was local organizations, local growers, local officials who were engaged in deportation before the big deportations and repatriations of the 30s. And then I'm thinking too about local organizations and corporations in the 30s. I mean, Phelps Dodge organized its own trains from the mining towns into Mexico. And maybe at the most perverse level, you had a Mexican-American organization like Friendly House in Phoenix that was founded by the Alianza Hispanoamericana that was helping repatriate Mexicans. Of course, Mexico was, during that period, wanted repatriations too, didn't they, in the 30s under Cardenas? So complicated story when you get beyond the sort of federal governments and look at all the different actors who were involved in it.
Yeah, I'll just pick up on that. Your comment, Jennifer, made me think of Kelly Lytle Hernandez's more recent book, City of Inmates, and how she argues, this sort of ties to your comment, Erik, about sort of Mexican organizations in the Imperial Valley, for example, in the 1930s, the Benito Juarez Mutual Aid Society is asking the federal government in Mexico to help them repatriate and to give them land. And that's a continual call for Mexicans in this region to ask for land. And so the thing that I take away from Kelly Hernandez is sort of to also not lose sight that Mexicans are within the boundaries that they have. They're sort of also engaging in agency. They're making decisions to go back, for whatever reason they're going back. Some of them are being pushed out, but some of them are also choosing to go back. And so the mutual aid societies, for example, are pushing for land in Mexico because they think that that's where they have better opportunities for the future.
Yeah, one other group that was doing that is Yaquis. I mean, to talk about indigenous people crossing borders, the Yaquis who managed to get a the state actually recognizes their right by restitution, right? Restitution to have this indigenous landholding, which was very rare in Mexico, right? It's something akin to a reservation, not quite. And so in the 30s, you had certain Yaquis in the Yaqui River Valley saying they wanted Yaquis to come back from Arizona. And, you know, most Yankees who went back found that land wasn't enough, because you also need water, you need credit, you need machinery, you need all kinds of things. So they end up becoming wage workers for the landholders there, or having to rent land from landholders in the Yaqui River Valley. But yeah, I mean, the agency of the people themselves, and of tribes, and of governments, Mexican government, not just the U.S. government, and the role they play in all of this certainly complicates the story of a U.S. monolithic state imposing restriction on everybody else. Anyway, I think we've gone now 15 minutes past time. I'm glad people stuck around to have a little bit of a conversation. But thank you, and thanks, Jennifer, really for organizing all of this. You did the hard work. We just all had to show up. Well, no, you had to do research. I just had to read it all. That was fun. So I appreciate it, and thanks for everyone for sticking around for the conversation.